a few hospital visits, and enough money to finally pay off her debts. For Maribel, a struggling waitress barely holding her life together, becoming a private blood donor for one of the wealthiest men in the city sounded like a strange but harmless deal. She didn't know his name at first, only that he was powerful, untouchable, and desperately in need of something money couldn't easily buy. That man was Preston Cross, the reclusive billionaire with a reputation as cold as the steel towers he owned. His empire was vast, his influence unmatched, yet behind the carefully guarded walls of his life, he carried a secret illness that threatened to strip away everything. Blood was his only lifeline, and Maribel's rare match made her more valuable than she could ever imagine. But nothing about Preston was simple. From the first time their eyes met across the sterile glow of the clinic, something shifted. He told himself it was biology, the strange pull of survival linking him to her. But every visit, every stolen glance, every hesitant laugh broke down the walls he had built around his heart. For Maribel, it was dangerous. Getting close to a man like Preston meant more than risking heartbreak. It meant stepping into a world where love was both a weakness and the most powerful weapon of all. Because what began as a transaction would soon become a love neither of them could control, and one that could cost them everything. The city never really slept, but tonight it felt like it had turned its back on me. Neon lights blinked on empty streets, puddles mirrored broken signs, and my reflection looked like a stranger in the glass door of the diner as I pushed it open after another double shift. My body felt like lead. My uniform clung damp with spilled coffee and fryer grease, and the ache in my feet was the kind that crawled up to your spine and stayed there. I counted the tips I'd managed to scrape together, mostly loose change, a few crumpled bills that smelled faintly of cigarettes. $22, barely enough for groceries, nowhere near the rent. My landlord's voice echoed like a curse in the back of my skull. End of the week, Maribel. No excuses this time. Pay or get out. By the time I trudged up the cracked stairwell to the tiny apartment I shared with Yvonne, every step felt like a countdown. Our building smelled faintly of mold and fried onions, the wallpaper curling away from the corners. Inside, Yvonne was at the kitchen table with a calculator, the screen glowing like a verdict neither of us wanted to hear. "You're late," she said without looking up. "Double shift," I muttered, dropping my bag on the floor. I slid into the chair across from her, my fingers still stained faintly with coffee grounds. She pushed a folded paper across the table toward me. "I found something, and before you roll your eyes, just hear me out." I opened it. Plain white paper, no logos, no frills, just black type, private medical donor needed, compensation generous, must be healthy, confidentiality required. I let out a sharp laugh that tasted like bitterness. This sounds like the beginning of a murder documentary. Yvonne finally looked up, her eyes weary but stubborn. "It's not. A girl at my job told me her cousin went once. They paid her thousands. For blood, Maribel. Just blood." I shook my head. "That's insane. Why would anyone pay that much for something you can get at any hospital?" "Because sometimes hospitals don't have what certain people need." She leaned closer, lowering her voice like the walls could listen. "Think about it. You've been working yourself into the ground, and it's still not enough. This could pay the rent. This could pay everything." I stared at the flyer, my chest tightening. I wanted to say no, to laugh it off, but the weight of that $22 in my pocket burned against my leg. I thought about eviction, about the endless cycle of double shifts and bills that swallowed me whole. I thought about how invisible I was, how small, how disposable. "I'll think about it," I whispered, though we both knew I already had. The clinic didn't look like a clinic. It looked like a fortress of glass and marble dropped into the wealthiest part of the city. My sneakers squeaked on polished tile as I followed a nurse down hallways so pristine they made me self-conscious about every breath. A part of me screamed to turn back. Another part, the louder one, reminded me that I didn't have a choice. The nurse guided me into a quiet room, sterile and humming faintly with the buzz of hidden machines. She took my vitals, drew blood, and murmured about rare compatibility. I tried to make sense of her words, but they tangled in my head like a language I wasn't meant to understand. And then the door opened. I didn't need an introduction to know who he was. Preston Cross. Even in the hush of this place, his name carried weight, power. Billionaire. Tycoon. The kind of man who built towers that scraped the sky, who made decisions that shifted entire markets. I had seen his face in magazines, but the man standing in front of me was no glossy headline. He was sharper, paler. His suit was perfection, but it clung to a frame that carried exhaustion in the slope of his shoulders. His eyes, God, his eyes were cold steel, cutting through me in a single glance. "You're the donor," he said. His voice was deep, rough in a way that felt both commanding and weary. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. He studied me in silence. Not like I was a person, but like I was necessary, vital, the way someone might look at a key to a locked door. "Dr. Gerald tells me your match is extraordinary." The doctor, standing quietly at his side, inclined his head but said nothing. I forced myself to meet Preston's gaze, though my heart hammered in my chest. "I was told it was just blood." His lips curved, not quite into a smile. "It is. But not all blood is equal." He took a step closer, his presence filling the room until I could barely breathe. "You don't need to understand. You only need to agree." The words should have chilled me, but instead, they left me trembling in a way I couldn't name. "I need the money," I admitted, ashamed of how desperate I sounded. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, gone before I could name it. Then he nodded once. "Then we have an arrangement." The nurse returned with equipment that gleamed under the sterile light. I lay back, the needle sliding into my vein, the slow rhythm of my blood filling a clear bag. My vision blurred at the edges, but through it all, I felt his gaze on me, steady and consuming. When it was over, I tried to sit up, lightheaded. Preston dismissed everyone with a flick of his hand until only we remained. "You'll return," he said, not asking but declaring. My breath caught. "How often?" "As often as I require." He stepped closer, his eyes lingering on me with a weight I didn't understand. "You'll be well compensated. But understand, Maribel, this arrangement requires silence. If a single word leaves your lips, you won't just lose the money. You'll lose far more." A shiver ran through me. "Are you threatening me?" His mouth tilted, dark and unreadable. "Warning you. My world is not kind, but..." His voice softened for a single heartbeat. "I always protect what's mine." The words struck deep, sharp and strange, echoing long after I left the clinic. Outside, rain fell steady and cold, washing the city in blurred colors. I walked with the envelope heavy in my pocket, my body light from the donation, but my heart heavier than ever. I had come here for survival, but something told me I had stepped into a current stronger than I could fight. What had I just agreed to? Would you take a deal that could change your life, even if you didn't know the risks? Maribel had always been good at disappearing. From the time she was a little girl standing at the edge of foster homes that never kept her long, she had learned the art of silence, how to be useful without being noticed, how to smile without showing her hunger, how to make herself small enough that rejection would sting less. By 24, she had mastered the art so well that entire rooms forgot she existed until a tray clattered in her hands or a customer snapped their fingers for service. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, depending on which manager still had patience for her exhausted face and her too thin frame. The diner where she spent her nights left her smelling of grease and burnt coffee, while the morning cleaning shifts in office buildings left her knees aching. All of it added up to just enough to survive, never enough to live. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the hardened layers of survival, lived a secret dream she never admitted aloud, that someone, someday, would look at her and see more than a waitress, more than a body to scrub floors or pour coffee. That someone would see her. Yvonne saw her, in her own way. The roommate who had become a sister of necessity rather than blood had a sharp tongue and an even sharper instinct for survival. Where Maribel bent to weather storms, Yvonne fought them head-on, pulling Maribel along whenever she faltered. It was Yvonne who shoved the strange flyer across the kitchen table, insisting Maribel consider the offer. "It's just blood," Yvonne had said firmly, her hand pressing down over Maribel's as though she could force her agreement through touch alone. "You give it every day at hospitals for free. Why not get paid? Why not let it save us for once?" Maribel hadn't argued because she had no argument left in her. Debt was already clawing at their door, and the landlord's patience had worn thin weeks ago. Across the city, Preston Cross lived in another world entirely. His penthouse loomed above streets he rarely walked, surrounded by walls of glass that reflected the skyline he owned piece by piece. To the outside world, he was a man carved from steel and numbers, a ruthless billionaire with no time for softness, no tolerance for weakness. He closed deals worth billions before breakfast, toppled competitors before lunch, and by dinner the media had already crafted their next headline about the cold brilliance of the empire he commanded. But behind the glass and steel, behind the meticulous suits and the mask of indifference, was a man carrying something no wealth could shield him from. Rumors whispered through boardrooms and newspapers alike. An illness, a weakness that explained his increasingly rare public appearances. Preston ignored the rumors, but the truth haunted every breath he took. His body betrayed him in ways he refused to admit, and for years, Dr. Gerald Gray had been the only man allowed close enough to see. Gerald had been more than a physician. He had been a confidant, a gatekeeper, and at times the only voice capable of pulling Preston back from the brink. Together they had scoured the world for answers. Treatments had failed, specialists had disappointed, and secrecy had become Preston's greatest ally. If the business world knew how precarious his health truly was, the wolves would tear his empire apart. It was Gerald who had discovered Maribel's blood type, a rare match, almost impossible to find. And it was Gerald who urged Preston to meet her, to ensure discretion, to secure what might be his final lifeline. Maribel's first meeting with Preston had left her unsettled in ways she could not name. She had expected an old man, perhaps, or a faceless figure too sick to leave his bed. Instead, she found a man who seemed carved from stone, every line of his jaw and every flicker of his gaze calculated to command obedience. Yet beneath the pallor of his skin and the sharpness of his words, she had glimpsed something else. Loneliness. A vast, cold loneliness that mirrored her own. She told herself it was her imagination, a trick born of fatigue, but she could not shake it. That evening, she sat with Yvonne on the narrow couch in their apartment, the envelope of money heavy in her lap. "So?" Yvonne pressed, eyes alight with hope and fear tangled together. Maribel hesitated. "He's not what I expected." "Rich?" Yvonne scoffed. "None of them are what we expect. Doesn't matter. Did you get paid?" Maribel nodded, though her mind lingered on steel-gray eyes and the way they had studied her not with warmth but with recognition, as if she were no stranger at all. Preston, too, found himself unsettled. He had met countless people who bent over themselves to please him, who sought his approval, his money, his power. Maribel had walked into that room with fear in her eyes, but dignity in her spine. She had admitted her desperation without apology, and still there was a quiet defiance about her, a refusal to shrink even under the weight of his gaze. That night, as Gerald checked his vitals and monitored the effects of her blood, Preston caught himself asking questions he had not intended. Who was she beyond this transaction? What kind of life had shaped a woman like that, so fragile on the surface, yet carrying a resilience that drew his attention like a flame? He dismissed the questions quickly, but they lingered, no matter how he tried to bury them. Days later, Maribel returned for her second session. This time, her nerves had hardened into something else. Determination, perhaps, or resignation. She sat straighter in the chair, watching as Gerald prepared the equipment. Preston entered quietly, his presence filling the space without need for introduction. "You're punctual," he observed. "I was told to be," she answered simply. Something flickered in his expression, amusement ghosting across his features before vanishing. Gerald excused himself to adjust charts in the adjoining room, leaving them in silence. "You understand," Preston said at last, his tone smooth and measured, "that this arrangement requires absolute confidentiality." Maribel met his gaze, steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "I don't exactly have anyone to tell." "You'd be surprised how quickly people find ways to talk when money or fear enters the equation." His eyes narrowed slightly, as though testing her resolve. "If a word leaves this room—" "I said I wouldn't," she interrupted, surprising herself with the sharpness in her voice. The silence that followed was heavy, charged. For the briefest second, the mask slipped from Preston's face. Beneath it was something raw, something wary, something almost human. And in that moment, Maribel understood. The warning wasn't just about protecting himself. It was about protecting something far more fragile than his empire, something he had not allowed anyone else to see. Neither spoke again as the blood flowed and the silence stretched. Yet when she left that night, she carried not only the weight of money in her pocket, but the strange certainty that she had stepped into a secret too dangerous to escape. And somewhere high above the city, Preston watched her leave, knowing with chilling clarity that this woman, this fragile stranger, now held the power to unravel everything he had spent a lifetime building. The third visit came faster than Maribel expected. Days blurred together under the weight of rent notices and the long hours at the diner. But her body remembered the clinic, the sharp chill of its air, the hum of machines, the way Preston's eyes lingered on her like a question he would never ask aloud. By the time she was guided back to the room, her nerves hummed like live wires. Preston was already there, seated, a file open in his hand, though his gaze lifted the second she entered. Something flickered across his expression. Not surprise, not even impatience, but recognition, like he'd been waiting. "You're punctual," he said again, echoing their last meeting, though this time the words sounded less like an observation and more like a test. "I said I'd be," she replied softly, the faintest tremor betraying her nerves. Gerald busied himself with the preparations, murmuring something about levels and dosage. Maribel settled into the chair, forcing her hands to stay still even as her chest tightened. She reminded herself that she had survived this twice already, that it was just blood, just survival. The draw began. At first, the familiar pull was steady, manageable, but halfway through her vision dimmed at the edges, a wave of dizziness stealing her breath. She tried to speak, but the words caught, and then the world tilted. The next thing she felt was steady hands catching her before she slid from the chair. Warm, firm, grounding. "Breathe," Preston's voice ordered, but it was softer than before, threaded with something almost unrecognizable. Concern. Her eyes fluttered open to find his face close, his gaze sharp but no longer cold. He was studying her intently, the mask of distance cracked by the sight of her faltering. For the first time, Maribel saw not the billionaire tycoon, but the man beneath, the one who needed her in ways money couldn't measure. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her cheeks burned at how weak her voice sounded. "You're not," he countered, his hand still steadying her arm. His thumb brushed just above her wrist, not intentional, yet enough to send a shiver spiraling through her. "Gerald." The doctor rushed back, checking her vitals, adjusting the flow. "A fainting spell," he muttered. "Nothing lasting. We'll shorten the session." Preston didn't move away immediately. His eyes lingered, searching, as though trying to read her beyond the surface. Only when Gerald reassured him did he finally step back, the mask of composure slipping back into place. But Maribel felt the shift. The moment when his voice, sharp and commanding, had cracked into something human. Later, while resting in the side room with a blanket draped over her, Maribel overheard them. The voices carried clearly through the thin door. Gerald's measured, Preston's low and tight with frustration. "She's not just helping," Gerald said. "Her blood is stabilizing the markers better than any case we've seen. It isn't coincidence. It's something unique to her." A silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Then Preston's voice, stripped of its usual control. "Unique? As in irreplaceable?" "Yes." Gerald's tone was certain. "We've tried substitutes, other matches. None hold. Without her." A pause. "Without her, I don't know how much longer you'll last." Maribel froze, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. Her heart pounded so loud she was afraid they would hear it through the door. She had thought this was a transaction. Blood for money, survival for survival. But this wasn't about convenience. It wasn't about options. She wasn't just a match. She was the match. The only one. Her stomach turned cold, her throat tightening around the truth she hadn't wanted. She thought of Preston's eyes, the weight of his hand holding her steady, the warning in his voice about secrecy. Now she understood. He wasn't only guarding his empire, he was guarding the fragile thread that tied his life to hers. Through the door, his voice came again, quieter but sharper, like a blade pressed too close. "Then she cannot leave. Do you understand, Gerald? Whatever it takes, she stays." Maribel's chest constricted. A chill ran through her, because she wasn't sure if he meant it as desperation, a plea to fate, or a command that would bind her tighter than chains. When Gerald returned to check on her, she schooled her expression, hiding the storm beneath her skin. Preston followed a moment later, composed once more, though the shadows under his eyes betrayed the cost of holding himself together. "You'll continue," he said evenly, his tone ironclad. "Not a request, not a plea, a declaration." Her pulse stumbled. She wanted to argue, to tell him that her life wasn't his to dictate, but the echo of Gerald's words haunted her. Without her, he may not last. She nodded, though her chest ached. Preston's gaze softened by the smallest fraction. "Good. Then we understand each other." When Maribel stepped outside into the night air, the city looked different. The neon glowed brighter, the rain smelled sharper, the weight of her steps heavier. She had come to the clinic thinking she could keep her distance, that this was nothing but survival. But survival now meant something far more dangerous. Her blood wasn't just saving him. It was the only thing keeping him alive. And with that realization, she knew her life had become entwined with Preston Cross in ways she hadn't chosen and might never escape. If someone's life depended on you, would you stay or walk away? The sessions multiplied quickly. As though once the line had been crossed, neither Maribel nor Preston could pause the momentum. She came back again and again, the rhythm of her days shifting between diner shifts and the hush of the clinic's sterile rooms. Each visit began with silence, but silence had a way of unraveling under the weight of proximity. At first, their words were clipped, necessary. Gerald's instructions, Preston's questions, Maribel's short replies. But silence could not contain curiosity forever. "You work nights," Preston remarked one evening, his tone more observation than question. Maribel nodded, eyes fixed on the needle sliding into her arm. "The diner, double shifts when I can get them. You shouldn't exhaust yourself before donating," he said. Her lips curved faintly, not quite a smile. "Exhaustion's the only thing I've had enough of to give." Something flickered in his gaze, the faintest shadow of recognition, as though he knew exactly what it meant to be consumed by the weight of too much. He said nothing more, but from then on, each visit stretched into conversation. Slow, steady, unhurried. He asked about the diner, about Yvonne, about what she wanted beyond rent and bills. She deflected at first, wary of exposing too much. But walls cracked under repetition, and she found herself admitting secrets she'd never said aloud. "I used to dream about painting," she confessed softly one night. "Not houses or walls, real painting, colors that made sense of the world." "Why stop?" His voice was low, genuine. "Because colors don't pay rent," she replied. The silence that followed was not cold, but heavy, weighted with something unsaid. Beyond the walls of the clinic, the world buzzed with speculation. Media outlets began circling like vultures, whispering of Preston's absence from key events, his refusal to appear at galas he once dominated. Articles questioned his health, murmuring of weakness, collapse, fragility. Stock prices trembled at the rumors, and whispers spread across boardrooms. Perhaps Preston Cross was not invincible after all. Maribel didn't follow the news closely, but even she couldn't avoid the tabloids stacked at the diner counter. Billionaire recluse hides mystery illness. Cross empire faltering? Customers leaned over coffee mugs to speculate, their voices dripping with schadenfreude. She told herself it wasn't her concern, but every time she saw his name in print, her stomach tightened. She knew what they didn't, that behind those headlines was a truth far more dangerous, tethered to her blood and her silence. And with each visit, the question gnawed at her more fiercely. Did Preston want her? Or did he only want what flowed in her veins? His eyes lingered on her when she spoke, his voice softened when she faltered, but always the truth loomed between them. She was his cure, his lifeline. If not for that, would he have noticed her at all? The thought cut sharper than she wished to admit. It was Yvonne who noticed the change first. One evening, as Maribel tucked an envelope of cash into the drawer they pretended was their savings jar, Yvonne's eyes narrowed. "You're different," she said. Maribel froze. "Different how?" "Lighter. Not happy, but not drowning either." Yvonne leaned back against the couch, studying her. "Whoever this client is, he's more than just a paycheck, isn't he?" Maribel shook her head quickly. "It's not like that." But her voice lacked conviction, and Yvonne heard it. She said nothing more, though her silence held both worry and warning. Preston noticed things she hadn't expected him to. One afternoon, she came home from the diner to find a white envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a receipt. Her overdue rent, paid in full. No note, no signature, but she knew. She confronted him at the clinic the next evening, her voice tight with both anger and confusion. "You had no right." He looked up from the file on his desk, expression unreadable. "I had the means." "That doesn't give you permission to run my life." His gaze sharpened, steel against steel. "You fainted here because you'd worked yourself to the bone. You live one step from eviction. If you expect me to ignore that when my survival depends on you, you're a fool." The words hit harder than she wanted to admit. She opened her mouth to argue, but his eyes softened at the edges, his voice lowering. "You deserve safety, Maribel, even if you can't afford it yourself." Her throat tightened. She hated that he made sense, hated that her anger tangled with something warmer, something that felt dangerously like gratitude. Still, the question burned in her chest. Was it her safety he cared about, or simply protecting his investment? The city's whispers grew louder. Rival magnates circled like sharks, none more so than Randall Hale. He had always been a shadow on Preston's empire, a man who thrived on weakness, waiting for cracks to splinter wide enough to shatter. It was at a rare charity event that the whispers turned into something more. Preston had insisted on attending, a public display of strength despite the pallor still etched into his skin. Maribel saw the pictures later, his tailored suit, his controlled smile, the way flashbulbs caught the faint sheen of strain on his brow. But it wasn't Preston's photograph that unsettled her. It was the man standing too close in every frame. Randall Hale. His smile was sharp, his eyes glittering with the kind of knowledge that cut deeper than rumor. And in one interview, when pressed about Preston's supposed illness, Randall leaned forward, lips curling with mock sympathy. "Mr. Cross has always been Resourceful, he said smoothly. I'm certain he's found himself a unique solution. Those solutions like that never stay hidden for long, do they? The words made headlines the next morning, splashed across every news outlet. Unique solution. Maribel's blood ran cold as she read them. Randall knew. Maybe not everything, maybe not her name, but enough to circle closer. Enough to make her realize that her secret wasn't safe, that Preston's protection wasn't just arrogance, it was necessity. And in that moment, staring at Randall Hale's smug face in print, Maribel understood. She wasn't just part of Preston's world anymore. She was a target in it. Maribel had grown used to the clinic's rhythm, the quiet hum of machines, Gerald's measured presence, Preston's looming silence that occasionally broke into questions that cut too close. But the night she stumbled into the wrong room, everything shifted. She had been searching for Gerald after finishing her draw. He'd left his chart on the counter, and curiosity, reckless and sharp, nudged her forward. The folder lay open, papers neatly arranged, Preston's name stamped at the top. She meant to close it, but the words on the page stopped her cold. Replacement donors, candidates under review. Her eyes darted down the list, each line pairing names and numbers, cross-referenced against her own. The words blurred, but the meaning was unmistakable. He had been searching for someone else, another her. The sting was instant, like betrayal pressed against her ribs. She wasn't unique to him, not in his eyes. She wasn't a lifeline, not really. Just a body with useful blood. The file slipped from her trembling hands, papers scattering across the floor. She scrambled to gather them, but when she looked up, Preston was standing in the doorway. His eyes caught hers, sharp, unreadable. You shouldn't be in here. Her throat tightened. You were going to replace me. He stepped forward slowly, each stride deliberate. I was exploring options. Options? Her voice cracked. That's all I am to you? A line on a list? A transaction? Maribel, no. She shoved the papers into his chest, her hands shaking. Don't say my name like it means something to you. You talk like I matter, like my life means more than my blood, but you had replacements lined up before I even understood what I was giving you. His jaw tightened, his composure straining at the edges. I was dying. I am dying. Do you think I could risk placing all my hope in one person? Her chest heaved, her heart pounding. Then what am I to you, Preston? Tell me. Am I just blood in a bag? Or do you even see me? The silence between them cracked. For the first time, he looked away, his mask faltering. I see you, he said hoarsely. It should have eased the ache, but fury still burned in her. You don't get to say that. Not when you've been planning to throw me away the second something better came along. Her words cut through the space between them, and suddenly Preston closed the distance. His hand caught her wrist, not rough, but unyielding, his eyes blazing with a storm she hadn't seen before. You think I could replace you? His voice dropped low, raw. You think anyone else could stand where you do? That anyone else could look me in the eye and defy me and still keep me alive? She froze, breath caught, anger tangled with confusion and something deeper. Then why the list? Because I was a coward, he admitted, the words breaking through clenched teeth. Because I thought I could outsmart fate. But there is no one else, Maribel. Not for me. Her pulse thundered. The air thickened, charged, and before she could think, before she could breathe, his mouth was on hers. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't careful. It was desperation colliding with fury, a kiss that tasted of defiance and need. She should have pulled away. She should have remembered every reason to hate him. But her body betrayed her, leaning into him, answering with a fire she hadn't known lived inside her. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, silence roared louder than any words. Maribel stumbled back, lips swollen, heart racing. Don't! Don't ever use me like that again. Preston's chest rose and fell, his gaze dark but shaken. Then stop making me lose control. She left before he could say more, her thoughts a storm. The days after the kiss blurred into confusion. She wanted to hate him, to anchor herself in betrayal, but the memory of his mouth, the heat of his hand on her wrist, haunted her every quiet moment. She told herself to focus on the diner, on Yvonne, on survival. But even there, shadows stretched long. She felt eyes on her when she walked home, a presence lingering just out of reach. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia, but one evening, as she rounded the corner to her building, a man stepped into the glow of the streetlight. Randall Hale. His smile was sharp, predatory, his suit immaculate in a way that screamed money and menace. "Miss Maribel, isn't it?" Her heart jolted. "Who are you?" "An interested party." His eyes gleamed as he stepped closer. "You've been keeping unusual company, private company. Tell me, what's it like being the secret cure for the great Preston Cross?" Her blood ran cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't." His smirk widened, dripping with mock sympathy. "But secrets like his? They don't stay buried long. Not when people like me start digging." She tried to push past him, but his voice followed, low and dangerous. "Careful where you walk at night. The empire you're tangled in doesn't forgive mistakes." By the time she reached her apartment, her hands shook too hard to fit the key in the lock. Yvonne grabbed her arms, asking questions she couldn't answer. All Maribel could hear was Randall's voice, echoing with the promise of exposure. When she next saw Preston, her fury mixed with fear. "He knows," she hissed, the moment the door closed behind her at the clinic. "Randall Hale followed me. He knows about me." Preston's face darkened instantly, his hands curling into fists. "What did he say to you?" "That I'm your cure." Her voice broke. "Preston, he knows." For once, he didn't mask the raw desperation in his eyes. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, his voice rough. "Then understand this, Maribel. If you walk away, if you let fear or betrayal pull you from me..." He stopped, his throat working, his composure fracturing. His eyes locked on hers, and for the first time he let the truth fall like a blade between them. "If you leave me, I won't survive." The words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable, binding her tighter than chains. Maribel left the clinic with her chest burning and her throat raw from words she hadn't wanted to say. Preston's confession, "If you leave me, I won't survive," still rang in her ears, but instead of binding her closer, it had pushed her away. She couldn't be defined by his desperation. She couldn't live as nothing more than a lifeline, an anchor tied to a man who didn't know if he wanted her or the blood that kept him alive. Yvonne didn't ask questions when Maribel staggered into their apartment that night, shoulders slumped, eyes rimmed red. She only pulled her into an embrace, the silence speaking for them both. For the first time in weeks, Maribel slept through the night without waking in a sterile room, without Preston's shadow in her mind. But the relief was fragile, already cracking when dawn broke. Days stretched without a single visit to the clinic. No more phone calls from Gerald. No shadowy envelopes slid beneath her door. At first, it felt like freedom. She painted again on scraps of paper Yvonne found, old jars of paint resurrected from the closet. The colors soothed her. For a while. But freedom had its price. The newspapers screamed louder each morning, "Cross Empire in crisis." Billionaire recluse Mrs. Key meeting, stocks plunge. Is Preston Cross dying? Maribel told herself not to care, that it wasn't her responsibility. Yet every headline left a hollow ache in her chest. Every whispered rumor in the diner twisted her stomach. She pictured him pale beneath the clinic's lights, his jaw tight as if holding back collapse. She remembered his hand steadying hers when she fainted, his lips crushing against hers in desperation. She hated that even betrayal couldn't erase the bond between them. Preston's world unraveled quickly without her. Gerald did what he could, but the doctor's calls went unanswered, his suggestions ignored. Preston buried himself in board meetings, refusing to admit weakness, but even his iron will couldn't mask the growing pallor of his skin or the tremor in his hands. His voice, once sharp enough to command silence in a room full of magnates, faltered mid-sentence. Stockholders whispered, rivals plotted, and Randall Hale circled like a wolf. Randall's smirk was everywhere, on the news, in interviews, on glossy magazine covers. He dropped hints with the precision of a predator, feeding the press carefully measured lies. "He's been hiding something," Randall said during one televised panel, his tone dripping with false concern. "And it seems someone has been hiding with him." Reporters pounced, twisting speculation into scandal. Soon, Maribel's face, snapped by a paparazzo as she left the diner, was splashed across tabloids. "Mystery woman linked to Cross. Waitress or gold digger?" She nearly dropped the tray she carried when she saw it lying open on a customer's table. The whispers followed quickly, sharp and cruel. By the end of her shift, she could hardly breathe. At home, Yvonne slammed the magazine onto the counter. "This is a setup. Randall's painting you as some opportunist." Maribel pressed trembling fingers to her temples. "And people will believe it, because who would think Preston Cross would need me?" "They don't know the truth," Yvonne shot back. "They don't need the truth," Maribel whispered. "The lie is easier to swallow." She tried to shut it all out, but the world refused. Reporters lingered outside the apartment, shouting questions about her secret affair with the billionaire. Her manager at the diner pulled her aside, apologetic but firm. Too much distraction, too much attention. She was let go with half a paycheck and a nervous glance toward the cameras flashing outside. For the first time, Maribel saw the full weight of what it meant to be tethered to Preston Cross. She had no control, no anonymity. Her life wasn't her own anymore, and yet, neither was his. Preston deteriorated further. At his headquarters, his voice broke in meetings, his signature on contracts wavered. Gerald begged him to rest, to swallow pride and call Maribel back, but Preston refused. "She made her choice," he rasped, collapsing into his chair, sweat beading his pale brow. "I won't drag her down with me." Gerald stared at him, exasperated. "And what of your empire? Your life?" Preston's eyes closed, the weight of exhaustion pulling at him. Better to lose them both than chain her to a dying man. But even as he said the words, his heart twisted, haunted by the memory of her voice, her fire, her lips against his in that raw, unguarded kiss. Randall seized the moment. At a press conference staged for maximum spectacle, he stood in front of reporters, flashing the same predatory smile. The Cross Empire is crumbling because its leader is distracted by a waitress. He hides behind closed doors with her, funneling resources to keep her close while the rest of us hold up the economy he's abandoned. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Questions exploded. Randall leaned closer to the microphones, voice dripping with poison. Is it love? Lust? Or has Preston Cross finally been undone by the one thing even money can't buy? Loyalty? The smear campaign worked. Stocks plummeted. Allies withdrew. The empire Preston had built brick by brick began to fracture. And in the eye of it all, Maribel sat in her apartment, trembling as she watched the broadcast. She could almost feel Randall's eyes on her through the screen, daring her to run, daring her to give up. But it wasn't Randall she feared. It was Preston, alone, unraveling, and too proud to reach for her. The breaking point came at the gala. It was meant to be a show of strength, Gerald's desperate attempt to prove the empire was still intact. Cameras flashed as Preston stepped into the ballroom, his suit impeccable but his skin drawn tight over cheekbones, his body swaying under the weight of weakness. He smiled for the crowd, but the effort was thin, the mask cracking at the edges. Maribel saw the images later, streaming across every news outlet. The glittering chandeliers, the champagne glasses, the the sea of powerful faces, and at the center, Preston, pale and unsteady. Then came the footage. A reporter's voice gasped mid-sentence as Preston's eyes rolled back, his body crumpling to the polished floor. Gasps, screams, the chaos of cameras flashing like lightning. Gerald rushing forward, calling for medics, the crowd scattering in shock. The broadcast cut to black, but the words scrolled across every screen, every paper, every whisper. Preston Cross collapses, life hanging by a thread. Maribel's hands shook as she dropped the phone, her breath caught between a sob and a scream. She had wanted freedom. She had wanted distance. But all she could feel now was the crushing weight of choice pressing against her chest. Would she risk her heart to save the man who had broken it? Maribel didn't remember making the decision. Only the moment she saw Preston's collapse replayed on every screen, her pulse stuttering, her world caving. She had thought walking away would give her freedom, that she could survive without the weight of his shadow. But as she watched him fall, pale and broken under 1,000 flashing lights, she knew with blistering clarity she could not live with his absence. By the time she reached the clinic, the night was thick with storm clouds. The city's lights blurred through tears she refused to wipe away. Gerald nearly stumbled when she burst through the doors, his weary face breaking into something like relief. "You came," he whispered. "Where is he?" Gerald didn't answer, just led her down the hall. Preston lay in the bed she had once sat beside for endless hours, his frame too still, his skin washed of all its warmth. Machines hummed around him, sterile and unfeeling. For a moment, Maribel couldn't move. The sight of him, once untouchable, untamed, now fragile as glass, stole the breath from her lungs. She forced herself forward, her hand finding his, cold beneath her fingers. "Preston." Her voice cracked. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to leave me. Not like this. Not when we—" She broke off, tears choking the words. His eyelids flickered, a faint groan escaping. Slowly, painfully, his eyes opened. They found her immediately, as though even in weakness, he had been waiting. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped. "Don't," she snapped through her tears. "Don't push me away again. No more walls, Preston, no more half-truths. If you want me gone, say it to my face. But don't you dare die without telling me the truth." His lips trembled, the mask slipping away entirely. "The truth?" "Yes." She leaned closer, pressing his hand to her chest, as though she could anchor him to her heartbeat. "All of it. No lies, no empire, no excuses. What are you afraid of?" His chest rose, shuddering. His voice was so quiet she had to bend to hear it. "Not death." His eyes burned into hers. "I've been walking toward death for years. That doesn't scare me anymore." "Then what?" "You," he whispered, broken. "Losing you. Loving you and watching you walk away. That's what terrifies me. Because money I can lose, power I can rebuild, but you? If you leave, I have nothing left worth surviving for." The words cracked something inside her, and before she could stop herself, her mouth found his. This kiss wasn't raw with anger or desperation. It was surrender. It was fire and salt and the aching promise of everything they had been denying. His lips were weak beneath hers, but the way he clutched her hand, the way his heart stuttered against her palm, told her he was still fighting for her. When they broke apart, her forehead rested against his, both of them breathing hard. "You're an infuriating man," she whispered, tears still falling. "But you're mine, and I'm not leaving again." Something fragile yet fierce lit his expression, a smile tugging at his pale lips. "Then maybe I have a chance." The reunion was not gentle. It was jagged and painful, stitched with confessions neither had wanted to face. But it was real. For the first time, their bond was no longer built on secrecy or blood alone, but on choice. Hours later, as Gerald checked monitors and adjusted medications, Preston refused to release her hand. and Maribel did not try to pull away. Yet, outside the walls of the clinic, danger gathered. Randall Hale was not finished. The gala collapse had given him exactly what he wanted: chaos. The press lapped at his every word, hungry for scandal. And Randall, ever the predator, sharpened his smile for the kill. Soon, he promised, Preston Cross's secret would no longer be whispered rumor. Soon, the world would know about the girl who had been his salvation. And once they did, Randall would have the weapon he needed to destroy them both. The storm broke not in the skies, but in the city's grandest hall, where Randall Hale had staged his ambush with all the precision of a predator. Cameras lined the marble steps, their lenses glinting like fangs, reporters packed shoulder to shoulder, hungry for blood. On stage, Randall wore his trademark smirk, the smile of a man who believed he had already won. The crowd hushed as Preston entered with Maribel at his side. He was pale, still recovering, but his posture was iron, his gaze steady. Maribel's hand trembled in his, yet she didn't let go. Together, they stepped into the trap. "Ladies and gentlemen," Randall began smoothly, voice amplified by the microphones. "We are here because the empire of Preston Cross has hidden a truth from the world. A truth so scandalous it threatens the very foundation of his business." Flashes lit up the room. Reporters leaned forward. Randall's smile sharpened. While his competitors worked tirelessly, while his shareholders invested in good faith, Mr. Cross concealed his illness and his cure. Or rather, he turned theatrically, pointing toward Maribel, his secret source. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Maribel stiffened, the weight of 1,000 eyes searing her. Randall relished it, pacing slowly, his words like poison. "This waitress," he sneered, "plucked from obscurity, has been keeping him alive. Paid in cash, hidden in shadows, while Preston played the world for fools. Tell us, Miss Maribel, how much did your silence cost?" Maribel's throat closed. Shame burned through her as cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of her expression. She felt small, cornered, every exit sealed. Randall had crafted the perfect spectacle. And then, Preston moved. He stepped in front of her, his presence a shield. His voice rang out, steady but fierce. "Enough!" The room froze. Preston's eyes, steel gray and unflinching, locked on Randall. "You want the truth? You'll have it. But not your version. Mine." Randall's smirk faltered. Preston turned to the cameras, to the sea of reporters. His voice carried not as a confession, but as a declaration. "Yes, I've been ill. For years I fought it in silence, believing weakness was unforgivable. But then..." His gaze shifted, finding Maribel. His tone softened, reverent. "Then I met her." Every camera leaned closer. "She is not my donor. She is not a transaction. She is the woman who saved me. Not because of what she gave, but because of who she is. I stand before you alive not because of secrecy, but because of love." The words struck like lightning. Murmurs spread through the hall, disbelieving, yet awed. Randall sputtered, trying to recover. "Love? You expect us to believe this? Waitress is the reason your empire still stands?" Preston's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Not stands, matters. Without her, everything I've built is meaningless." The press exploded with questions, but something unexpected happened. The tide turned. Instead of ridicule, admiration rippled through the crowd. Preston's honesty, raw and unpolished, carried a weight no smear campaign could rival. And Maribel, standing tall despite the fire in her cheeks, looked nothing like a gold digger. She looked like devotion. Randall's smirk cracked. "You're a fool, Cross. You've given them your weakness. The board will eat you alive. Your empire will crumble." "Perhaps," Preston said, his gaze never wavering. "But I'd rather lose an empire than lose her." The room erupted, not in mockery, but in applause. Flashbulbs burst like fireworks, reporters shouting questions tinged with respect instead of scorn. Randall's plan had backfired spectacularly. The press conference ended in chaos, but it was Preston and Maribel the cameras chased, their hands clasped as they slipped into the waiting car. For the first time in weeks, Maribel's chest loosened, the weight of shame replaced by something startling. Pride. She looked at him, her voice trembling. "You told the whole world." "I told the truth," Preston replied simply, his thumb brushing over her hand. "No more walls, no more lies, not with you." Tears stung her eyes. She had braced herself for half measures, for guarded words. But he had given her everything, in front of everyone. "Preston?" she whispered. His gaze softened, all steel melted into devotion. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small velvet box. For once, he looked almost uncertain. "I've risked my empire, my reputation, my pride, all of it. But the only risk that terrifies me is losing you again." He opened the box. Inside, a ring that caught the light like a promise. "Maribel, will you marry me?" Her breath hitched. The world outside roared with chaos, but in that moment, everything narrowed to his eyes, his trembling hands, his heart laid bare. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, Preston." The relief in his expression was staggering, a fortress crumbling into joy. He slid the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the fire and tenderness he had once denied himself. This kiss wasn't desperation, it wasn't anger. It was devotion, absolute and unshakable. When they pulled apart, Maribel's tears had turned into laughter. Preston rested his forehead against hers, his voice low. "Let the world say what it will. All that matters is this. You and me." And in her heart, she knew. It was enough. More than enough. Outside, Randall Hale faced cameras that no longer looked at him with awe, but with suspicion. His trap had crumbled, his power fractured. But inside the car, away from the flashing lights, Preston and Maribel held each other as though they had already won the only victory that mattered. Because they had. Would you sacrifice everything you've built to protect the one person you love? The months that followed the press conference were unlike anything I had ever experienced. For the first time in my life, survival wasn't measured by the numbers on a screen or the reports Gerald laid across my desk. It was measured by the warmth of Maribel's hand in mine when the nights were too long, and by the laughter she brought into a house that had once been as silent as a tomb. My treatment stabilized. Gerald said the markers were holding stronger than expected, my health no longer swinging like a pendulum over the edge of collapse. The world wanted to believe it was medicine, money, science. But I knew better. My empire had been saved not by wealth, but by the quiet strength of the woman who refused to let me die alone. Maribel was no longer the waitress hidden in shadows. The press that once called her a gold digger now spoke her name with a reverence they didn't even realize they'd learned. She hadn't sought the spotlight, but it found her anyway, and she bore it with dignity that humbled me. What they saw as grace, I knew as courage. The courage to love a man who had almost destroyed her trust, who had almost lost her forever. I had spent decades believing vulnerability was weakness, that to admit need was to surrender power. But with Maribel at my side, I learned the truth. Vulnerability was the only way to live honestly. And love, the kind that stripped me bare and still left me standing, was the only empire worth defending. The morning of our wedding dawned soft and golden, as though the world itself had decided to grant us peace. I stood at the window of my estate, overlooking the gardens transformed into a sanctuary of white blossoms and lanterns. Reporters buzzed outside the gates, hungry as ever, but they were nothing more than static. Today wasn't theirs. It was ours. Gerald adjusted my tie with the same fussing he'd once reserved for medical charts. "You look pale," he muttered, though I caught the smile tugging at his mouth. I always look pale, I shot back dryly. Not like this, he said, meeting my gaze. This is different. He was right. I wasn't pale with illness. I was pale with anticipation, with the weight of knowing that today I would promise myself to her not as a patient to his cure, not as a billionaire shielding a secret, but as a man offering the only thing he had left unguarded, his heart. When the music began and the guests rose, I turned. And there she was, Maribel. She walked down the aisle with a calm that belied the tears glittering in her eyes. The dress wasn't ostentatious or jeweled like the heiresses I had seen parade at galas. No, it was simple, elegant, a soft white that seemed to glow in the morning light. She carried no jewels except the quiet pride in her smile. Every step she took was a vow without words. I choose you. I keep choosing you. My breath caught. For years, I had built walls to keep myself untouched, unshaken. In one glance, she reduced them all to rubble. When she reached me, her hand slid into mine, warm, steady, certain. The officiant began, but the words blurred. My world had narrowed to her eyes, her pulse beating against my palm, the faint hitch of her breath as she tried not to cry. When it was time, I spoke my vows. I hadn't written them down. They had lived in me, burning, waiting. Maribel, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. I spent my life building walls so high no one could climb them. I thought strength meant silence, that power meant never needing anyone. And then you came. You saw me when I was breaking. You saved me when I didn't know how to save myself. You gave me life twice, first my body, then my heart. I am yours in sickness and in health, in loss and in triumph, for every lifetime fate dares give us. Her tears fell freely then, but her smile never wavered. When she spoke, her voice was steady, filled with quiet fire. Preston, I thought I was invisible until you saw me. I thought love was something that belonged to other people, not to girls like me. But you showed me that even in the shadows, love finds a way. I don't want your fortune, your empire, or your name. I just want you. I'll keep choosing you, even when it's hard, even when it hurts, every day for the rest of my life. The officiant declared us bound, but the only moment that mattered was when I pulled her to me and kissed her. The applause roared, the cameras flashed, but all I felt was her lips, soft and certain, sealing a promise older than words. The reception spilled across the gardens, laughter weaving through the air. For once, I didn't hover at the edge, calculating every move. I was in the center, her hand in mine, our friends and allies surrounding us. Even the board members who had once doubted me now raised their glasses in toast, not to power, but to love. Later, when the music softened and the guests thinned, I pulled her into a quiet corner beneath the lanterns. The world had blurred into stars and shadows, but she was clear as flame. You know, I whispered, pressing my lips to her ear. I've made deals worth billions. I've built an empire brick by brick. But the only thing that ever mattered was this moment. She laughed through the tears still clinging to her lashes. Preston Cross, the great negotiator, finally admitting he was wrong. I smiled, cupping her cheek. Not wrong. Just waiting for the right deal. And you, Maribel, you were it. You saved my life twice. First my body, then my heart. And I'll spend every day proving I deserve it. Her hand pressed against my chest, where my heart beat steady beneath her palm. Then we'll make every day count. I kissed her again, the world falling away until only she remained. Months ago, I had feared death, weakness, ruin. Now, I feared nothing. Not because I was untouchable, but because I was no longer alone. And for the first time in my life, I knew what true strength was. It was love. Do you believe love can heal wounds deeper than any medicine? Tell us in the comments.